thing I know, I'm right there beside him. Next thing I know, up there in the ceiling is a scuttle hole. And he just reached up there with the handle of that broom and boosted the lid off of that scuttle hole. And quicker than I can tell you, he had me by the feet, and there I go, right up in that scuttle hole. Well, it was a good place to hide for a while anyway. This was a young couple. Oh, yes, this was a young couple, about in the 30s. And I tell you, when they got me up there, then, you know, they set me up water. They set up pillows, they set up blankets, and they would send up food, but I couldn't eat the food that they had, and I didn't want to get any sicker than I already was. And I said, I don't want any food now. But they sent me up water, and they were very good to me. I'm up there all the rest of that evening, that day, all of the next day, that night and all the next day, and that next night and the evening when it got dark, I called to them and said, please help me down. I want to travel while it's dark. It's safer for me. And they got me down out of that scuttle hole, and when I got down, first thing I said to them, do you have any maps? And they said, well, what kind of a map do you want? And I told them about where I was, the name of the place, where I was. I don't know where I am right now. I said, where am I? And they told me. All right, I said, will you please, if you have any maps, will you find how far it is from where I was picked up to where I am right now? It was 750 miles. That's how far those priests had taken me. All right, now they took me out in the kitchen. They fixed some breakfast for me. And, you know, that woman took a shoebox and fixed some food up in a shoebox for me. And more than that, they gave me 75 cents in money, and I went to the door. I was going to leave. And she looked at me, and she said, she was a very large woman and taller than I. And she looked at me, and she said, would you like to take off your holy habit and put on one of my dresses? Well, I was so much skinnier than I am. My goodness alive. I looked at her and wondered how in the world I could ever wear her clothes. But, you know, finally, I thought I would be safer. All right, I went in her bedroom, and that woman gave me some of her clothes, and I put them on, and thank God for a belt, because that's the only way I could keep them on. And there was no shoes. I didn't have a pair of shoes that would fit me, so I went to the door again and got ready to leave, but I rolled my holy habit up in a little bundle and was going to carry it with me. And when I got to the door, she observed I hadn't taken my headgear off. And she said, wouldn't you like to take your headgear off? It would be safer for you. And of course, she didn't know what's under that headgear. I have a bald head, just a little stubble all over my head, and I was embarrassed and ashamed of it. And I tell you, I didn't want to uncover my head. But finally, I went in the bedroom. She says, I have a little black cap. All right, I went in the bedroom with her, and we took my headgear off, and she gave me a little black cap, and I pulled it down over my ears and had to cover my bald head. Now, that's the way I walked away from those people's home. I tell you, I really looked like something that come out of the ark. It was a horrible-looking sight. I know it. You don't have to tell me. And I was just as embarrassed as I could be and just as heart-sick as I could be. Now, where am I going? I'm going back to Uncle John's. I'm not going back to my father's. Because of what my father said. You remember, a few that were here, and I don't have time to go back and give you a synopsis. It's impossible. But when I was first out of the convent and they got me back in the United States and found my people, my father said to me, Charlotte, you're sick. But as soon as you get well, you have to go back to the convent, and that put fear in me. And I was afraid my father would put me back in the convent. I was scared. And so I didn't go back to my father's home. All right, but I'm going back to Uncle John's home. And that was a long trip back there, 750 miles. So I started out. That means I'm going to hitchhike. And that means I'm barefooted. You just start hitchhiking at my age barefooted and dressed like I was dressed. It's a horrible thing. All right, you know what I did? I run out of food, which you would know. And more than that, the first night, where am I going to sleep? I happen to be a woman. And I've been in the convent most of my life, and I'm scared to death of the outside. I was then. And oh, I was so fearful. I saw this farm home, and I thought I'd just go up to the door and ask them if they'll let me lay down on the back porch or the front porch of the garage. I had a car garage right closed. And do you know that woman shut the door right in my face? Oh, sick. I was so heartsick. I wept and wept. I just left and walked back out in the road and went back down this way a little bit, and there's a ditch there and there's some weeds, and I got down in that ditch and I stayed right there. I don't know how late. I have no idea, but I stayed there until I saw the lights go out in that home. And then I got out of that ditch and I walked right back over to that home, right close to this kitchen door. I wrapped that holy habit around me because the weather was quite cool, and I laid on the ground right there. Don't worry, I was gone before daylight, but I felt a little safer just close to somebody's house. Oh, it was a terrible feeling. All right, I'm on my way the next day, and I'm out of food now, and that 75 cents, I didn't want to spend it, and we are such paupers in the convent. We don't have handkerchiefs like you have. Not for a moment. We have a rag, and I had the dirtiest rag you've ever seen with me, and so, you know, I had that 75 cents tied up in it and had it get down in my clothes. Oh, I'm going to save that. I might need it real bad. All right, so the next day I traveled, and I would go up to a door, and this woman, I remember I knocked on the door, screen door, the back door. I'd never go to anybody's front door. And I said, would you let me have something to eat? I'm hungry. And all she had to do is look at me and see I was half starved. And that woman just now had me come in on the porch. She went and fixed me some warm food. And that woman, oh, she was so good to me. And she gave me some change. And I'll tell you, and then she fixed me up some food to take with me. I will appreciate it. There are a lot of wonderful people in this world. They're not Christians either. What, wouldn't they make wonderful Christians? Oh, my. I think about it so often. All right, so that's the way I was traveling. Day after day, begging for a place to sleep, begging for a place to get something to eat. And you know, by the way, I'm barefooted. And after all, maybe you don't know what it's all about, but oh, I walked over everything. And after I'd been out about 2 months, my feet got so bad, I'd sit right down on the road and cry like a little kid. I felt like I couldn't take it. I just felt I couldn't stand it. Nobody ever offered me any shoes. I'm not a beggar ordinarily. I wouldn't beg for anything. I had to beg for food. Oh, yes, I did beg for food, but I wouldn't beg for clothes, never. All right, and I didn't ask anybody for shoes, and nobody offered me any shoes, so I'm barefooted. And I never said anything about my feet. When I was hungry, I just asked for some food, and so on and so forth. All right, I went on for 4.5 months. Maybe the last 2 or 3 days, I was walking on the railroad track. I'm following my maps. Those folk gave me their maps and marked them for me. I'm following the map. I know I'm possibly 25 or 30 miles from Uncle John's. And I was walking on the railroad track close to a little town. And you know what I did? I was in such a terrible condition and my feet were so bad. And I went into that little old railroad station. There was a man in there. And I said, is there a bus or is there a train? And I told him where I wanted to go. And he said, and that was early in the morning. He said, not until late this evening. And I said, well, how much would it cost for me to get there? Now, numbers of people along the way had given me some change. And I had it tied up in that rag, hidden my clothes. All right, so he told me, but I didn't know how much money I had. I went in the bathroom and I excused myself, and I took out that rag, and I counted the money. I had enough to buy the ticket and a little bit left, and I come out and bought the ticket. All right, then I was so weary, and he didn't offer me any food to eat. He didn't offer me anything. And you know, I lay down on one of the benches there in that small depot, and I went sound asleep because I'm very weary. And he waked me when the train came in. I didn't even hear that train, and it was just one coach and an engine. And you know, folk, when I went out to get on that train, oh my, you might know what I looked like, and I was filthy dirty by this time. All right, I got on that train, and there were some young people sitting on that train, and there were some older people. And do you know, the minute I stepped up in the coach, those young people just began to laugh out loud and make fun of me. You don't know how that feels. I couldn't help the condition I'm in. I had nobody to do anything for me, not a soul, and I couldn't help the way I looked. Young people, let me warn you something right quick. You better not make fun of people. God may stretch you out on your back somewhere and disfigure your face until you'll never want to walk down the street again. Don't make fun of anybody because they're less fortunate than you. It's dangerous business to make fun of people. I couldn't help the condition I'm in. The older people made fun of me too, and on it went. Well, I cried most of that 25 miles. All right, the train pulled into where Uncle John is, about 69,000 people. I got off of that train, and I had my holy habit wrapped up in a little bundle, and you know, I'm going to Uncle John's. But let me tell you, folks, there were several blocks I had to walk. But I cannot tell you right now, I didn't come up to his front door. I wouldn't embarrass him like that for anything. He has a lovely home. And I spent those several months there. That's where I was picked up. All right. So I went to the back door, and he has a fence around his backyard, opened the gate and come down the back sidewalk. When I walked up to the kitchen door, there's a pane of glass in the kitchen door, and there's white curtains on it, and I could see through those curtains that Uncle John was preparing his breakfast before he went to the office. And I knew he didn't have very much money, and I didn't want him to see me looking like this, and my heart was broken. But I thought, I'm sick, and I'm weary, and I'm hungry. And I just rapped on the door, and when I did, that dear old man opened that door, and when he did, he just cried out, "My God, Charlotte, what's happened to you?" Well, I thought he might have had a part in what happened to me, but I didn't know. But you know, when he pulled it over, or opened the door, he said, "Come on in." I stepped in Uncle John's living room, and he just left me. He said, "Wait just a minute." And he walked into the bedroom, and Uncle John brought out a telegram. It had been opened. He had read it. It was to him. And you know, when he handed the telegram to me, folks, I read that telegram, and when I read it, I had all the hatred I thought one heart could hold, but I had a whole lot more after I read that telegram. Who was it from? That telegram's from my father, and that telegram telegram was to Uncle John. And the telegram said, John, we know where Charlotte is. She's in safekeeping. And my father's name is on that telegram. In other words, my father's responsible for me going back to the convent. But you don't understand. Oh, no. My mother's laying there paralyzed. I told you 7.5 years before I got back in this country. Horribly paralyzed. I told you about her last night. And every time after I was out of the convent, every time any member of my family, and the church is just across the road from my home, every time any member of my family went over to the church, and especially my dad, you know, to confessional box, and the priest would never give them absolution from their sins. Why? Not until they starved me back into a convent. And that meant if my mother died, she would be lost. There would be no absolution from her sins. She'd have to go to hell. And I tell you, my daddy didn't want my mother to go to hell anymore than any of you folk want to go to hell. He was scared half to death. And for that is the reason that my father informed those Roman Catholic priests my whereabouts, and that's why I was picked up. Oh, listen, folk, you don't know the half of it. The fear and the bondage those people are under. But I finished reading the telegram, and I just exploded like dynamite. And I'll assure you, I said a lot of unlovely things. And oh no, I was not a Christian. I didn't know God. I knew nothing about Him. All right, but Uncle John come over and took a hold of my shoulders, and he said, Charlotte, please don't talk like that. He said, I don't want to hear you say things like that. That's terrible. And he said, honey, you sit down right there. I sat down. It was a straight back chair. And he sat me down right there, and he pulled one right up close to me. And he said, now I want to tell you a story, and I want you to listen. I knew that he looked very well. I saw that he'd taken on some weight. I learned to love him when I lived with him. They were very good to me and on. All right, now I want you to listen carefully to this story because I think it's good for you to hear the story. He told me about a family. They lived right next door. And of course I knew the mother and father. Yes, our mother, father, husband, and wife he's talking about. That family was married 13 years before God blessed that union with their children. Then God gave them 3 lovely little girls. They're all Roman Catholics. My people are all Roman Catholics. Uncle John's Roman Catholic. All right, Uncle John told me this story. He said, Charlotte, you know, when the oldest child of those 3 was 6 years of age, the father began drinking, and he became an alcoholic. Now, maybe you know what an alcoholic is. Daddy drank up the paycheck. The kids went hungry. Their clothes wore out, and there was no money to buy them. The paint went off of the house. The furniture wore out. Everything was wrong because Daddy drank up the paycheck, and the kids and mother had to suffer. And he was a beast when he was drinking. He was one of those men that fight everything. All right, when those little kids would see their daddy coming down the street, they would make a run to Uncle John. Uncle John, that name, never had any children. Uncle John, 67 years of age at this time. But they never had any children. And all those kids would run over there, and they'd take them in their home and protect them from that drunken father. And many times the mother would see him coming. She'd grab the 3 little girls and bring them over to Uncle John. Uncle John and Aunt Mame learned to love those children like their own. And they protected them from that drunken father so many times because he beat them so badly, and he beat the mother. And folks, this went on for a long period of time. And I was watching all of this. All right, then, you know, one day, after a number of years, several years went by, and the girls were getting bigger. One day, Uncle John said, I saw the Arthur family. They come out on the front porch on a Sunday morning, and he saw them coming down the front steps, but the daddy, there was one of the daughters on either side of the daddy. He had plenty of liquor under his belt that day, and he was coming down the steps, and they were helping their father down the steps. And they went somewhere, but Uncle John didn't know where in the world they were going. He never saw this before. For years, they've never gone anywhere, because there wasn't any clothes to wear that was fit to wear, and so on. All right, he found out about 1:30 when they come home. He found out that somebody had invited those people to church, to one of our Pentecostal churches. Yes. And you know, they went to church, and they said it was not don't misunderstand me, it was Assembly of God Church, but it was a Pentecostal church. It was a massive church. It would seat 2,500 people, and had 2 big balconies back there like that. And you know, when the Arthur family came in, they all sat there, but Mr. Arthur sat in the seat right by the door. He was just, well, drunk. All right, they sat there. That revival went on for 5 long weeks. And some of the people were watching them closely, and he permeated the building with the liquor he had under his belt. You know, that's a terrible smell. All right, but people wanted to win those people for God. And so it went on and on and on. Then one day, Mrs. Arthur, one night, Mrs. Arthur and those 3 lovely girls, after some of the women in the church had talked to them, they hit the altar. folk, they went into that altar and they began to weep before God. And they began to cry out to God and tell him what a sinner they were. And they was asking God to forgive them of all the sin in their life, clean them up and make them what they ought to be. All right, it was really wonderful. And you know, they were seeking for the Holy Ghost. And this was